Did you know that in March 1920, the Ruhr region of Germany declared itself an independent socialist republic? The Ruhr had always been a very heavily industrialized area, and so it should come as no surprise to you that there was a large following of the communist and socialist belief set in these areas, and that after the turbulent period at the end of the Second World War, large groups of these communists in the Ruhr region had armed themselves. Now, the area had played a very important role in the November Revolution in 1918, which had resulted in the toppling of the Kaiser and the founding of the Weimar Republic, as well as during the Spartacist uprising. Now, although they didn't really take up arms as much as in Berlin, when the Berlin Spartacist uprising was quelled by the Freikorps, things seemed to be calming down in the Ruhr as well, but this wasn't to be the case. Now, the catalyst for this independence declaration from the communists of the Ruhr was the Kapp Putsch, which resulted in the government, the Weimar government, the democratic one that had been elected in 1919, being ousted from power, and instead it seemed that a return to the autocratic state was the only way forward. I actually have a video about the Kapp Putsch if you'd like to see it there. Meanwhile, the Weimar government had fled to Stuttgart. Now, in Stuttgart, they really didn't have much control over the army. Large parts of the army actually joined the Putsch, so the rebels, and it seemed that they were on their last legs. But Friedrich Ebert, the president of the Weimar Republic, announced from Stuttgart a general strike, and he was the leader of the SPD party, so of course striking was what they did. And in the Ruhr, as well as large parts of the country, including Berlin, large parts of the country went out on strike, and they essentially shut down the entire country, all the manufacturing, industry, transport, etc., which made it very difficult for the putschists to retain control. Now, the only difference with the Ruhr region from the rest of Germany during this time is that in the Ruhr they successfully managed to take over government buildings and instigate an armed revolt. They tried to do this in Thuringia and Saxony, other areas of Germany with strong communist following, but there they failed. However, in the Ruhr, the communist rebels were successful, and the Red Guard, the people who were installed to make sure that the revolution could continue, so essentially the armed branch of the revolution, was installed in the Ruhr region against the putschists, as well as against the Weimar government later on. So the Freikorps were sent in, who were these right-wing groups of essentially squads of veterans who were sent in to put down any dissidents. They'd been sent in to put down the Spartacists, for example, in 1919. However, the Red Ruhr Army, as they came to be known, ambushed them, about 600 of them, and managed to take all of their weapons, including weapons that were much better than their own, giving them a large advantage over any armies that would attack them later on. Now, throughout the rest of Germany, this strike had crippled the Kapp Putsch, and by about the 22nd of March, it was declared that the strike was over because the putschists had given up. And it's then that the Weimar government came back to Berlin triumphant. They had actually survived the putsch, but they then had the problem that the Ruhr region was still declaring its own independence. So they issued the fact that the strike is over on the 22nd of March, everyone can just go back to work. But the people in the Ruhr region refused to do this and retained the fact that they were still an independent country. But would these communists stop striking and rejoin Germany? No. Instead, their plan of action was somewhat different. Now, the Red Ruhr Army operated in small groups, often using bicycles to get from place to place, which has a kind of nice Dutch feel about it. But besides this point, it's when the Freikorps and the Reichswehr, the professional German army, are both sent into the Ruhr area under the commands of General von Vater, who is an experienced general. And these prove to be too much for the Red Ruhr army, and they start taking heavy casualties as the region is regained. However, this does have diplomatic and political issues for Germany, because the Ruhr region is adjacent to, sometimes considered as part of, the Rhineland. And the Rhineland at this time was actually an occupied, demilitarized zone where the Germans weren't allowed to send troops in. So when they invaded, they really annoyed the French, actually. And especially when the communists were fleeing out of the Ruhr area into the French-occupied Rhineland, the German army actually pursued them on several occasions, and this could have resulted in another war with the Allies, because obviously this was in breach of the Treaty of Versailles, which could mean another war. Although this didn't end up happening because the British stepped in and they said, you know, if you do it again, then it will be war. And they actually managed to avoid a further conflict. But that's one of the areas where something could have gone wrong if the German army kept pursuing them. But essentially what's important to remember is that it was an incredibly brutal campaign by both the Freikorps and by the Red Ruhr army. Both killed civilians indiscriminately and one another, had they surrendered or not. Anyone found with a gun in the Red Ruhr area was simply shot on sight if they weren't in a Freikorps or Reichswehr uniform, so it was an incredibly brutal war. And on that lovely note, thank you very much for actually I forgot the casualties. So the Reichswehr actually lost 331 casualties during the war, whereas the Freikorps, remember the more disorganized units of roving right-wing death squads, as I like to refer to them, who were basically mainly veterans, they lost 273 casualties. Meanwhile, the Red Ruhr army definitely came off the worst with over 1,000 casualties. And I think, this would spell more trouble with the French in the future. It wasn't quite over in the Ruhr area, but to find out about that, you'll just have to watch my next video in the Weimar Germany series. So, I hope you have, and this is the end. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video about the Red Ruhr Army, the Red Ruhr Uprising of 1920. Started in March and ended around that time too, didn't last very long. But it's interesting to think what could have happened if this hadn't been the end of the communist state in the Ruhr area. And now there is another communist state in Germany that rose and fell and actually lasted a little bit longer, with an interesting historical background to do with later on Hitler as well. So I'm going to be covering that in another video, as well as some others on the Weimar Republic, more things happening in the future, as well as some that I've already made, which will be linked in the description below, and you can watch all of these in the playlist which I will make. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video about the Red Ruhr Rising of 1920, and I hope to see you all again. Bis später.